Professor Mickens, could you state your full name and spell your last name for the court?
Yes. My full name is James Williamson Mickens, and my last name is spelled Mickens.
Good afternoon, sir. So, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
That's better. We wanted to come in under the mic. So, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Mickens, what is your occupation?
My current occupation is a professor of computer science at Harvard University.
And Professor Mickens, which subjects do you teach at Harvard?
I teach an undergraduate level course on operating systems, and then I teach a graduate level course on computer security.
Could you provide the court with a brief summary of your educational background, Professor Mickens?
Sure. I got my undergraduate degree from Georgia Tech, where I got a bachelor's degree in computer science, and then I went to get a PhD in computer science at the University of Michigan.
And Professor Mickens, what did you do before teaching at Harvard?
Before I got to Harvard, I was a researcher at Microsoft Research in Redmond, Washington. I worked in the distributed systems group. And then during that time period, I also had a stint as a visiting professor at MIT in the parallel and distributed operating systems group.
Professor Mickens, have you ever been an expert witness in litigation before?
I have not.
What experience do you have in the area of mobile device security?
I have performed a variety of research projects in that area. For example, looking at secure ways to expose mobile sensors like cameras and accelerometers to applications. I have also supervised a variety of student research projects on that topic, and I reviewed a variety of papers on iOS security for the top conferences in my field.
Your Honor, I understand that this might not be necessary, but I'd like to offer Professor Mickens as an expert.
You submitted. I'm now beginning to get into some of the questioning, understand why antitrust lawyers offer them, so that when they sit on the stand again, they can say, have you ever been admitted? And then they can say affirmatively, yes. Typically, when trial lawyers don't offer them, it's because they don't want the jury they don't want the jury to have my imprimatur on it, and so they don't ask. That's why I say it's not necessary. But I now understand why antitrust lawyers do it. Proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Mickens, when were you employed at Microsoft?
I was employed starting in 2008, and I stopped working there in 2015.
And did you have oversight responsibility for anybody during your time at Microsoft?
The only people who reported to me directly were summer research interns. These were graduate students who came to Microsoft to perform research under my direction.
Have you had any affiliation with Microsoft since the time you left the company in 2015?
I have been invited to serve as a panelist in several iterations of a mentoring conference that Microsoft holds for PhD students who have received a Microsoft PhD fellowship. I was also in 2018 invited to something known as a research faculty summit. Basically, Microsoft invites a variety of professors from different institutions to come to Microsoft to talk about their own research and share some of the research that Microsoft is doing.
Do you have any ongoing relationships with anyone from Microsoft today?
None other than a research collaboration that I currently have with a researcher in Microsoft's New York lab.
Does that research collaboration relate to mobile device security?
It does not.
Professor Mickens, could you please explain your assignment in this case?
Certainly. I was asked to evaluate the security of iPhones as it relates to the App Store, and more generally as the security of the platform relates to various channels of distribution for applications that arise on an iPhone.
And did you submit an opening written direct testimony in this case?
I did.
Who wrote that testimony?
I wrote that testimony solely myself.
Does that appear at tab 1 of the binder that you have in front of you, labeled Exhibit Expert 5?
Yes, I believe that it does.
Does that appear to be a true and correct copy of the testimony that you wrote?
It does appear to be so, yes.
So, Your Honor, subject to the same understanding with the other written testimony, we would offer that for admission.
It is provisionally admitted as with the others.
Thank you. Professor Mickens, what materials did you rely on to formulate your opinions in this case?
I relied on several different sources. I first of all relied on academic articles about computer security that were submitted to conferences considered reputable in my field. I also relied on public-facing documentation that Apple provides about its products. I relied on the work of reverse engineers who have analyzed how Apple's products work. In particular, I looked at a book written by Jonathan Levin, considered one of the experts in reverse engineering, to understand his analyses. I also looked at articles in the popular press, which talked about various aspects of computer security. And finally, I relied on my own expertise and research and training in the field of operating systems and security.
Professor Mickens, are the sources that you listed the types of sources that you typically rely on in your academic work?
They are. Both myself and other academics in the field of computer security and operating systems oftentimes cite or rely on evidence from the various sources that I just described.
And Professor Mickens, could you give a high-level summary of the conclusions that you reached in connection with your assignment in this case?
Yes. So a high-level summary of my conclusions is shown in this demonstrative, and my conclusions are 4 in number. So first of all, I found that if you look at the security properties that an iPhone provides to its users, then those security properties are mainly enforced by the operating system, which in this case is iOS. And so what this means, as listed in my sort of second summary of conclusion bullet, is that when we look at the benefit that the app review provides, well, that app review actually provides minimal additional security benefits compared to the security benefits that an OS alone could provide. And so what that means sort of in layperson's terms is that the safety of your experience on an iPhone is largely guaranteed by iOS, not by the app review process. Now, the third conclusion that I came to is that if you look at iOS, as it's currently designed today, iOS is already capable of installing applications that didn't come from the centrally managed Apple App Store. And this is true both of iOS and of macOS, another Apple-designed operating system. And my fourth high-level conclusion is that if iPhones were indeed opened up to third-party distribution channels, in other words, if third-party app stores were allowed on the iPhone, then that would not result in users of the iPhone suffering from a meaningfully less secure experience on those devices.
Professor Mickens, could you explain at a high level what you mean when you use the term security?
Yes. If we go to the next demonstrative, then what we see here is a sort of 30,000-foot view of the various security mechanisms that an iPhone uses to protect users. At a high level, we can break these individual mechanisms into 3 categories. At the bottom, we see security mechanisms that are enforced via on-device hardware. And by hardware, I just mean components that are physical in nature, like the touch screen, like the CPU, like memory, so on and so forth. And so at the very bottom, we see hardware-based security mechanisms, for example, involving biometric authentication. How does the phone deal with fingerprint scan data, for example? Now, if we look at that middle row is labeled on-device security mechanisms that are enforced by the operating system. And just to be clear, when I say on-device, I mean the actual device that the user uses, like the actual iPhone, for example. Now, in my opinion, it's that middle layer of security mechanisms, the ones enforced by the on-device operating system, that are the most important. And the reason is that the operating system is responsible for configuring or managing many of these security properties provided by the hardware level. And furthermore, there are security properties that the operating itself is really uniquely situated to provide. So that middle layer, in my opinion, is the most important layer with respect to security.
is it all? Do you have an opinion as to why the Android has more security issues than the iPhone?
So this may come up throughout the direct and the cross. My opinion is that if you look at various commodity operating systems, so for example, like iOS or Android, I believe that they are in the same rough equivalence class when it comes to susceptibility to malware, viruses, or things like that.
So you don't think there's a difference between the two devices in terms of security?
I don't think there's a meaningful difference. Now, that's a bit subtle. What do I mean by meaningful? Why am I qualifying it like that? Because I think that at the margins, for example, we could identify certain specific types of malware that might only affect iOS versus, let's say, Android. But if we look sort of holistically at the big picture of security, then I think that these two platforms are roughly equivalent in terms of their security properties.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Professor Mickens, I think that you explained to us the two bottom layers of the demonstrative that we're looking at here. What is the top layer showing?
Yes, sir. Well, what the top level shows, this is sort of the third tier of security enforcement on an iPhone, and I call this tier off-device security that is related to app distribution. In other words, the mechanisms by which an application is reviewed, if at all, and the mechanisms by which developers are registered, if at all, with some central authority, and the extent to which applications are signed. We'll probably go into this in more detail during the rest of my testimony, but what are signatures? What does that mean? Well, a signature connotes attribution and integrity. It basically tells you where a particular piece of digital content, where it came from. That's the attribution part. And then it also tells you, has that content been tampered with by some external party in a way that the original signing authority would not have liked. So those are the three layers of security on an iPhone.
So, Professor Mickens, you testified that you believe that the operating system is the most important security layer. Could you just give us a very high-level summary of how an operating system works?
Sure. So if we go to the next demonstrative, then here we see what I think is a helpful analogy for understanding how an operating system works. So first, before we think about operating systems, let's first think about going to a restaurant, okay, something you're all fond of doing back in the pre-time. So if you go to a restaurant, let's say that you're a customer, and you want to get something to eat. So in most restaurants, you as the customer can't just go to the kitchen and start preparing the meal yourself. Instead, there's a chef who is the executive, if you will. It's the chef who ultimately controls how the ovens work, how the ingredients are combined, which ingredients are used, so on and so forth. And so the chef is the executive of the kitchen. Now, in most restaurants, though, you as a customer can't just directly ask the chef to do things. Instead, there's wait staff, people who sit in between you as the customer and the chef. And so you have these levels of intermediation. So even though the chef is the ultimate controller of what happens in the kitchen, by having that wait staff layer, we essentially allow the chef to focus on the lowest level task of running the kitchen. Whereas we can defer the work of customer service and showing people menus. That can all be deferred to the wait staff. So that's the way a restaurant works. Ultimately, customers want to interact with the kitchen, but to do so, they have to go through several intermediate layers. Now, if we look on the right-hand side of that demonstrative, what we see is the organizational structure for a computing device. So, for example, like a desktop, a laptop, or in fact, like an iPhone. So what we see is that at the lowest level, we have the hardware that's associated with that device. The physical components, once again, like the CPU, like the touchscreen, so on and so forth. So apps are all the way up at the top. Apps are the things that users interact with, the things that they download, they install, that they see on their home screen. Now, ultimately, those apps want to interact with the hardware to do things like send network data, read or write from a storage device, interact with other apps. However, much like in a restaurant, how a customer can't directly do things in the kitchen, on a computing device, the apps can't directly manipulate the hardware. That's what the operating system is responsible for. And so the operating system, that's what we see in those two middle layers. And so at the lowest layer of the operating system, we see the kernel. That's analogous to the chef in a restaurant. That's the ultimate determinant of what happens on the machine, what happens in the hardware. But then above the kernel, we have this thing called middleware. And by way of analogy, you can think of middleware as being analogous to the waitstaff. So oftentimes when an application wants to do something on the phone, it doesn't just talk to the kernel directly. Instead, it sends a request to the middleware. The middleware might do some initial processing of that request, send it to the kernel. The kernel then decides whether or not to fulfill that request, and if so, how.
Professor Mickens, the court has heard some testimony this week from economists who discuss the term middleware as a particular type of cross-platform software. Is that what you're referring to when you talk about middleware in your testimony?
Not quite. So the word middleware is used in a variety of contexts in computer science and can be a bit confusing to understand which one is being used, which context. So here I specifically mean software that has been written by the OS vendor to assist with the operation of the operating system's kernel.
And Professor Mickens, why is it that you believe the operating system is the most important security layer?
The reason why I believe that it's the most important security layer is because when we think about what makes an application malicious or benevolent, well, those distinctions are client-side distinctions. Now, that word may come up a couple of times throughout my testimony in the cross. What I mean by client-side is simply the device that the user uses. And I use the word client-side to distinguish from the server side. So, for example, there's a computer run by Apple or someone else, maybe somewhere in the cloud doing analyses over there. That's what server-side means versus client-side, which is just what's happening on the user device. So when we look at the notion of what makes an app malicious, what makes a program malware, for example, that's a behavioral definition. We're saying that malware is bad because it tries to do bad things. And so those attempts at doing bad things are all happening on the client-side device, on the iPhone itself in this example. So when we think about how do we protect a user, a human user, from malicious applications, that boils down to how do we prevent malicious behavior on that user device? And it's the operating system that is uniquely situated to see the types of bad behavior that apps may try to perform. And so that's why I think that the operating system is the most important layer of security.
Professor Mickens, could you just provide us a very high-level summary for how an operating system enforces security on a device?
I'd be glad to. So let's now look at the new demonstrative that we see here. So what I'm going to do is step you through some of these ovals, and I'll provide a high-level overview. I'd be glad to provide more technical details if that's so desired. But at a high level, when we're looking at the security mechanisms that an operating system provides, the first category of protection involves memory protection for the kernel. Okay, that's a lot of jargon. What does that mean? Well, let's think about another metaphor, another analogy. So imagine that you're thinking about a program. And you can imagine that program, it's a person. It's a person who wants to achieve some task. Now, that person is in an office. That office might have a big bookshelf full of books and records and so on and so forth. But when that person wants to work on a particular task, they have to bring a subset of the total things they have in the bookshelf onto a desk. And that's where we have the set of things the person has worked on right now. So we have a person, a bookshelf, and a desk. By way of analogy, when we look at applications, when we look at iPhone, for example, you can think of the bookshelf as being analogous to a storage device. So it's very large and contains a wide array of things that applications might possibly want to work on. However, when an application wants to work on a specific set of things, it has to bring information from that bookshelf into the desk. And so if we look at what happens on a real device, the bookshelf is a storage device, and the desk is memory. So what I'm referring to right here when I say memory protection for the kernel, I'm saying there are a certain set of security techniques that prevent applications that may be malicious, that may have programming bugs in them that are misbehaving for whatever reason. These memory protection mechanisms I'm showing you here prevent those applications from tampering with and stealing information in the memory that belongs to the kernel. So that's what that layer is doing right there.
Professor Mickens, could you describe the other layers that the operating system enforces?
Yeah, so if we go to the next demonstrative, so what do we see here? So here we see a series of security mechanisms that are designed to provide memory protection, not only for the operating system, but also for the apps as well, the programs that users install and launch and that they see on the home screen. And so at a high level, the goal of these security mechanisms is the same as the ones that we just looked at. We want to make sure that malicious or buggy or otherwise misbehaving applications can't read or write the memory state, the memory information that belongs to other applications or to the operating system itself.
And what else? What other security layers does the operating system provide?
So if we go to the next demonstrative, then what we see here is we see the sandboxing layer. So the sandboxing layer, in my opinion, is one of the most important types of security mechanisms that an operating system provides. So we see in that little blue call out to the right, that call out is saying that sandboxing isolates misbehaving processes. That just means misbehaving applications. And so what does it mean to misbehave? Well, as I mentioned earlier, when we think about what the distinction is between malware and non-malware, between quote-unquote good apps and bad apps, those are behavioral distinctions. Is that app trying to do something bad on a real user's client-side device? And so what sandboxing does is it essentially interposes on, it examines the type of behavior that an application is trying to perform. Now, in a device like an iPhone, and really in any commodity operating system, the only way that an application can interact with the outside world, whether that be the operating system, hardware on that local machine, other apps, the only way that can happen is if an app asks the operating system to perform a behavior on behalf of that app. Now, the technical term for the mechanism by which apps make that request is called a system call. I mentioned this in my expert witness report. But you can just think of that system call, it's just a request. So if an app wants to write to a storage device, it just sends a request to the operating system.
But can't that by having the app on the iPhone or any commodity device, isn't that in fact the risk of someone inadvertently having something like that on their device, and then all of a sudden the whole system is compromised? I mean, that's why you don't open up emails where you don't know, who they come from and other things like that. Isn't that the concern?
Well, sandboxing helps to address some of those concerns. So what you were talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, is basically what is the damage that can be done if somehow something bad gets on a client device and then that application runs somehow. Well, sandboxing is one of the critical security mechanisms that operating systems use to restrict the scope of damage, if you will. So even if somehow a malicious app gets on a client device, sandboxing says, well, you can't do everything. So, for example, you as the app, you can't write to arbitrary places in the storage device. So sandboxing precisely tries to provide protections in some of the things that you were mentioning.
So if apps get onto the device through a system over which, in this case, Apple has no control, the sandboxing can still take care of it? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and this is an extremely important point. So if you look at how sandboxing works, sandboxing, and in fact, all of these security mechanisms are agnostic as to the means by which an application gets on a device, like a phone, for example. So even if there is, let's say, a third-party app store that delivers a malicious app, or in fact, if there was a malicious app that comes through a first-party app store, that does happen. The OS can still sandbox that app and restrict the kind of damage that it can perform.
Okay, listen.
Okay, thank you. So that is the purpose of the sandbox layer. It is to restrict the types of interactions that an application can have with the rest of the system.
And Professor Mickens, there's one final layer here that you didn't mention. Could you just describe what that does?
Yes. So if we go to the next demonstrative, then what we see here is the layer of the operating system that performs digital signature validation. Now, I briefly mentioned signatures before. Just as a reminder, a signature is basically a note that you can attach to a piece of digital content that provides attribution and integrity. So where did that piece of digital content come from? Did it come from an individual developer? Did it come from a company, so on and so forth? And also integrity. Has that digital content been tampered with after it was generated by the person that we've attributed it to? And so this layer in the operating system can basically look for signatures that are attached to digital content that's arrived on the machine, and then based on some type of security policy, determine whether some particular action should take place. So for example, whether a signed application should be allowed to be installed or not.
So Professor Mickens, going back to the court's question a moment ago, are any of the layers that you just identified as on-device security layers that are implemented by the operating system, are any of those layers dependent on the means by which an app arrives on the device?
They are not. And if we go to the next demonstrative, yes, this in fact is what this demonstrative shows. Why are these security mechanisms independent of the means of app distribution? Well, at a high level, it all gets back to how do we define something being good or bad. It's not about the way in which that application arrived on the phone. It's all about what does that application try to do once it gets there. And so all of these mechanisms that we're looking at here are looking at behavioral aspects, restricting or observing somehow what applications try to do. And that can be done regardless of the distribution channel by which an app arrived on the phone.
Professor Mickens, were you asked to evaluate the security aspects of the App Store distribution channel?
Yes, I was.
And could you just explain to the court how a developer goes about distributing an app through the App Store?
Yes. So one important thing to keep in mind about this model is that if you're a developer and you want to create an app and distribute it to users on an iPhone, you can't just do that yourself independently. You can't directly distribute it to end users. Instead, what you have to do is go through an Apple run process. So at a high level, the way this works is that imagine we have a developer.
Have you ever created an app?
Excuse me?
Have you ever created an app yourself?
I have, but none that have been distributed publicly.
Okay. Have you ever gone yourself through the process with Apple?
I myself have not, no.
Okay, just curious.
Yes, no worries. Let's see. So let's imagine that we have a developer for iOS who wants to create iOS apps. Let's imagine that her name is Alice. So before Alice can do anything, she must first register with Apple's developer program. This essentially makes Alice a known entity to Apple, and Apple gives to Alice at a high level a set of cryptographic information. The details we don't need to get into unless people are curious, but suffice it to say that after Alice registers with Apple, she can now sign applications such that Apple can tell that a particular application came from her as opposed to some other person. Okay, great. So now Alice is registered with the developer program. Alice now starts to construct her app. So she writes the code, she creates the data, maybe she's bringing in images and stuff like that. She develops the app. And finally, Alice determines, okay, my app is good. It's ready to be used by users. Now, once again, Alice cannot just directly put the app up on her website and allow people to install it. Instead, Alice has to submit that app to the centrally managed review process that Apple manages. And so what happens at this point is that Alice uploads her app. It's signed by Alice. This allows Apple to determine the provenance, the attribution of the app, and also allows Apple to tell them the app hasn't been tampered with. So now the review process looks at Alice's app and tries to determine whether, in Apple's opinion, this app is acceptable for distribution on iPhone. The characteristics that Apple looks for are enumerated in the public-facing app review guidelines. Some of those properties involve security, but many of them do not. So Apple reviews the app, and if the review is successful, in other words, if Apple deems this app worthy to be distributed to the App Store, Apple then takes the app and now signs it itself. In other words, Apple now signs the app and then publishes this on the public-facing App Store. So let's imagine now that another user, Bob, comes along, and Bob wants to install Alice's app. Bob has to go to the Apple-run App Store, find the app listed there, and then he downloads that onto his own iPhone. Now, what the iOS on his iPhone is going to do is it's going to check to see if this app has been signed by Apple. If it hasn't, then Bob's iPhone is not going to allow that app to be installed. Otherwise, the app is allowed to be installed. So you can think of that signature from Apple on the app as acting as an Apple stamp of approval, basically, that iOS will check for at installation time.
Professor Mickens, could you explain the types of security properties that the app review process screens for?
Yes. So what we're seeing on this demonstrative here, this is a high-level taxonomy of the types of security properties that the review process purports to scan for, like if you were to look at the public-facing guidelines. So there are 5 different classes of security properties that the review process tries to screen for. So let me explain each one of these in turn. First, we have sandbox compliance. Now remember that a sandbox is basically a way of restricting the types of behaviors that an application can perform. And so sandbox compliance just means that the app review is trying to determine whether a particular app has been behaviorally restricted in appropriate ways. If you look at that second property, exploit resistance, that's basically talking about the following fact. Even if you as a developer are well-intentioned, in other words, even if you're not trying to write malware, your program may still have some logic errors or things like this that might allow an outside party to subvert the operation of your application. And so exploit resistance is basically trying to check whether the application has been structured in a way that makes it less likely to be subverted by an attacker. All right, so now let's look at this third property, malware exclusion. Now this is different. So in the second category, I was saying, assume that a developer is benevolent but may have written bugs in the application that allow the application to be subverted. What we're looking at with malware exclusion is that now we're trying to say, well, some apps may be intentionally malicious. And so malware exclusion tries to prevent those applications from running on the user device in the first place. So now let's look at these 2 final properties. So first, user consent for private data. At a high level, what this means is that if an application tries to access private data, like camera data, like your GPS data, so on and so forth, then the application should have to prompt the user for consent before the app can actually access that data. Now, I should say that there are 2 types of private data. One type is computer-generated private data. This is data that comes from a hardware sensor, for example, like a GPS unit, like a camera. Or it's data that comes from a database that is managed by the operating system. So an example of this is like your contact list. So all of that type of private data, I categorize as being computer-generated private data. There's a second class of private data that I call human-generated private data. And that's private data that, for example, you might enter into the text field of an app. You enter in your birthday, your social security number, your credit card, things like that. So the ultimate source of that data and the management of it resides with you, the user. So that's what user consent for private data is about. If an app tries to access those types of data, is the user prompted so that the user can provide explicit consent before that data is released? And then finally, we have this property called legal compliance. So this property is easy to state, but it's difficult to enforce. It basically means if you have an app that's being used by a user in a particular legal jurisdiction, well, does that app satisfy all of the laws of that particular jurisdiction?
And Professor Mickens, have you undertaken any comparison between these security features that you've just listed as being enforced by the app review process and those that are enforced by the operating system?
I have. And in fact, if we look at this demonstrative up here, I categorize which of these security properties can be enforced by an OS alone. So what we see at a high level, what this chart is saying, is that we have in each row the security property that I just talked about. And then the two columns that we see off to in the middle and in the right talk about, can an operating system enforce the security property, and can an app review enforce the security property? And so what we see is that for the first three security properties, sandbox compliance, exploit resistance, and malware exclusion, an operating system is perfectly capable of enforcing these security properties without any additional assistance from an app review. Now, if we look at those bottom two categories, at a high level, what we're seeing here is that both an app review and an operating system have a difficult time enforcing these properties. And so the high-level takeaway point from this is that we see that there are three properties an OS can provide by itself. There are two properties that both the OS and the app review struggle with, and this informs my expert opinion that when you look at the primary guarantors of security for the user experience on an iPhone, the app review provides minimal additional security properties beyond those which the operating system already provides. Now, if we look at this table, we can go row by row, and I can explain my reasoning behind this. So, for example, if we look at sandbox compliance, remember what that's about is it's saying, can we ensure that an application's behavior is restricted? And remember that the way that an application interacts with the rest of the system is via system calls, via requests that are sent to an operating system. Well, these are all client-side behavioral properties, the types of requests, the types of system calls that an app is generating. So an operating system, which is actually on the client device, is perfectly situated to enforce this particular security property. If we look at that second row, exploit resistance, so that's all about trying to make benevolent but possibly buggy applications be robust against attempted attacks by outside parties. Well, when we talked about a few demonstratives ago, all of those memory protection techniques, those are all exploit resistance techniques. Those are all techniques that make an application more difficult to attack, to subvert. It makes it more difficult for malicious parties to steal data from apps or to overwrite that data. And so an operating system is also well equipped to enforce these properties as well. All right, so let's look at this third property here, so malware exclusion. So this is the idea that we want to prevent malicious code from executing on a client device. Well, you can provide that property within the operating system, either by having first-party malware scanners or by having third-party malware scanners. Why can we do this? Well, once again, malware, we define the goodness or badness of an application with respect to the behaviors that it tries to perform. And so because the operating system is the manager of the device, it can act as a platform for excluding malware. Okay, so now let's look at those bottom two categories. These are the categories where I think that it's difficult for both an OS and an app review to provide the security properties. So let's first look at user consent for private data. Well, as I mentioned, there are two different types of private data. The first is computer-generated or computer-managed private data, things like your contact list or things like sensor data from your phone or from your accelerometer. Well, the way that applications would attempt to read or write that data is via system calls, via requests that are sent to the operating system. So the operating system is the thing that sees those requests. And so thus the operating system is uniquely well situated to enforce user consent for that type of private data. Because when the OS sees a request from an app to access, let's say, your GPS unit, the OS itself can put up a prompt and say, user, do you authorize this particular request? So an OS is perfectly well situated to perform that type of security check. Now, I did mention a second type of private data. This is human-entered, human-generated data. So, for example, something like a birth date that you type into a text form. Well, here it's difficult for an OS to detect such data and track how it's manipulated, in part because there are so many different ways that a user can enter that data into a device. For example, a birth date can be construed as like day, month, year, or month, day, year. How many digits do you have for the year? Is it 4? Is it 2? So it's a hard problem for software, and OS included, to automatically determine what human-generated data of a private nature looks like. So an OS struggles to track that data, but so does the app review. It's actually hard for a human user to discover, by human user I mean a human app reviewer. It's hard for a human app reviewer to test all the various parts of an application, see all the various places where private data might be requested. It's also hard for either a human reviewer or an automated technique like static or dynamic analysis. It's hard for all these approaches to figure out how that data might be computed on and how it might be shared with external third parties. So both the app review and the operating system struggle here. And that's also the same for legal compliance. Both the app review and the operating system have a tough time determining whether an app satisfies the requirements of arbitrary laws. And one main reason for this is that these laws are oftentimes complex, and even human lawyers and judges may disagree over what these laws mean. And whether
You're not suggesting that there's no value to human review, are you?
No, I'm not. Instead, what I'm suggesting is that the benefit of human review is marginal at best, for a variety of reasons I can go into now or discuss later.
Assuming that we get through. If not, we'll come back.
Okay.
Professor Mickens, I believe you testified that your bottom line conclusion here was that the app review security layers provide minimal additional benefits beyond what's already enforced by the operating system. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Have you been following the trial proceedings these past 2 weeks?
I followed some of it, yes.
Have you read or heard any testimony that you view as relevant to that conclusion?
I have, yes. I've read transcripts of several pieces of testimony that I think bolster the conclusions that I'm making here. So, for example, Cosmica, who helped to run the review process for Apple, he testified that the average amount of time that is spent on an app review is, I believe, 6 to 12 minutes. 6 to 12 minutes is not a very long amount of time. And what that means is that if you are someone who's trying to flip something past the app review, the human aspect of it, you only have to get that app to look like it's legitimate for 6 to 12 minutes on average before it'll pass through that human aspect of the app review. So that's one piece of testimony that buttresses my opinion.
Your Honor, excuse me. This is outside the scope of the report. The internal processes of app review were not considered within the report.
The human processes were not considered in his report?
Your Honor, perhaps I can...
Let's point me to the paragraph of his direct testimony where he talks about human review.
So, Your Honor, he reviewed the guidelines. He was not able to access internal documents related to the internal processes of human review. This is just testimony that supports his ultimate conclusion, which was disclosed in the report.
Could you answer my question and point me to the paragraph?
Yes, Your Honor. So, Professor Mickens' written direct report, paragraph 67. I believe Professor Mickens explains...
Just let me read it. Right. Okay, well that doesn't do it. I see the legal compliance finishes at 76. What you just said is not all that remarkable. Why don't you move on? I'm not seeing anything beyond that.
Sure, thank you. Move on.
Okay. So that was one piece of...
Why don't you just... He's going to ask you a new question.
Oh, okay. Excuse me. Thank you.
Professor Mickens, is the App Store the only way that apps can be distributed on an iPhone?
No, it is not. So there are several additional distribution channels, two additional ones of which I discuss in this demonstrative that we see here. So we just talked about the Apple App Store mechanism for distributing apps. That's the one that's best known to layperson users. However, there are a variety of additional models that can be used on an iPhone. So for example, that one in the middle, the enterprise program, this model basically allows an enterprise to act as a distribution hub for applications that are distributed to the iPhones of employees for that business. So here the basic idea is that the enterprise first has to go to Apple and has to register with the enterprise program. If Apple agrees to let the enterprise into the program, then the enterprise can then allow its own internal developers to create apps, to sign apps. And these apps are going to be signed by the enterprise developers, not by Apple. That's the difference between this program and the App Store program. And then those apps that were created by the enterprise developer can then be distributed via in-house mechanisms. So in other words, the enterprise itself can have a server, for example, that distributes those apps directly to enterprise iPhones. And so what we see in this model is that we see a difference in how apps are signed and how apps are reviewed. So in this distribution channel, apps are signed by enterprise developers. They're not signed ultimately by Apple before they're distributed to end-user machines. And also, apps are not centrally reviewed by Apple as they are in the App Store program. Now, if we look at that distribution channel off to the right, that's an internal distribution channel that's intended for use by Apple internal engineers. So the basic idea here is that if these engineers are trying to test various aspects of iOS, then they don't want to be hassled by the burden of having to get all of these test apps signed and then reviewed. That just slows down the engineering process. So in this distribution channel, an Apple engineer can install and execute an app that hasn't been signed by anyone and that hasn't been centrally reviewed by Apple.
So, Professor Mickens, what is the significance of these other distribution channels to your opinions in this case?
The significance is shown on this demonstrative that we see here. So what we're seeing here is that each row is a different kind of distribution channel. So the App Store, the Enterprise program, and the internal Apple testing distribution program. Now, what we see is that off to the right, sort of those blue sets of boxes, we see that each of these three app distribution channels has a different approach towards whether apps are reviewed by Apple to developer identification. In other words, who gets to pick which developers can use this distribution channel. And these different models also have a different approach towards code signing. Are applications signed, if at all, and if so, by whom? And so what we see is that despite the differences in that blue side of the table, the check marks and the X's and the partially not by Apple, we see that for all three of these distribution channels, we still have check marks in the column that says on-device security as enforced by the operating system. And so this is very important because what this shows is that already iOS supports multiple distribution channels. This is already the case. And furthermore, in these distribution channels, these on-device security mechanisms are still enforced. And so this is quite relevant when it comes to this idea of a third-party app store, because you can imagine that if we were to allow a third-party app store on the iPhone, it might have some different checks and X's and so on and so forth on the right-hand side of the table, but it could still have that green check when we look at on-device security mechanisms enforced by the operating system.
Professor Mickens, have you also evaluated the macOS as part of your assignment in this case?
I have.
And what is macOS?
macOS is the operating system that Apple has designed for its laptops and its desktops.
And how do apps get onto a macOS device?
So at a high level, there are three different distribution channels for a macOS device, as shown in this demonstrative. So first we have the Mac App Store channel. This is very similar in spirit to the iOS App Store channel on iPhones. Essentially, developers must be registered with Apple. Once they are registered, they design their apps for macOS. They upload a signed version of them to the Mac App Store review process. If the app passes the review process, Apple then redistributes the app via the official App Store, but now it's signed by Apple, not by the individual developer. So that's one model for app distribution on macOS. Now there are two other ones. Look at the one in the middle. That's third-party distribution with notarization. So what this means is that, well, developers still have to be known to Apple, so they still have to register with Apple's developer program. But now, when the developer wants to distribute their app, they submit it to Apple for the purposes of notarization, not for a full review. And so at a high level, you can think of notarization as just being a malware scan. So Apple looks at the app, checks to see if there's any malware in there that is known to Apple. If the answer is no, then Apple essentially generates a signed message which says that we, Apple, didn't find any malware in this app. And now the third-party developer is free to distribute this app, which is signed by the developer, not by Apple, via a distribution channel of the developer's choosing. So in other words, in this model, apps are signed by the developer, they're not signed by Apple, and the review process is minimal. It essentially only just checks for malware in the app.
In your industry, is the iOS viewed as a stronger operating system than the macOS?
How are you defining stronger?
More secure.
I think there's a diversity of opinions on that. I mean, certainly, if you talk to Google people, they wouldn't agree. I think in my expert opinion, and I sort of touch on this in my report, in my direct written testimony, I think there is rough equivalence in terms of security between iOS and Android.
No, I said iOS and Mac OS.
Oh, not Android. Sorry. Okay. So the question is, would I say that iOS and Mac OS are in the same rough?
Is iOS more secure than Mac OS?
I would not say that it is meaningfully more secure.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Professor Mickens, I think that you are describing the third-party distribution with notarization channel that appears here. Could you just briefly summarize third-party distribution as it appears in the far right-hand column of this demonstrative?
Yes. So what we see all the way off to the right is a distribution channel by which apps are not reviewed, and furthermore, they're not even notarized. And so in this distribution channel, when an app arrives on a user device, it is unsigned, or it's signed by someone that Apple is not aware of. And it's also not reviewed. And it's not even checked for malware by Apple. And so this is a distribution channel that is allowed by Apple today. It allows this form of app to arrive on a user device.
Professor Mickens, are macOS and iOS completely different operating systems?
They aren't, actually. If you look at how they're structured from the engineering perspective, then what you see, as shown in this demonstrative, is that iOS and macOS share critical infrastructure, critical plumbing.
I'm sorry, Professor, do you have, did you review the Apple data?
To determine...
Did you review proprietary information to reach these conclusions, or is this your outside view opinion?
I viewed no confidential Apple information. Now, for example, with respect to this demonstrative, how did I come up with this? So
the reason I'm asking is because I haven't heard from Apple. So if Apple's experts who write the code or whatever come in and say these systems are different, I take it then you wouldn't necessarily have a basis to disagree because you haven't seen their proprietary information. Is that right?
No, I wouldn't agree with that, and here's why. Because if we look, for example, at this diagram here, there's that part that says OS kernel, Darwin. That's a kernel that's shared by both iOS and macOS, and that's open source.
Okay.
So I have looked at that. That's publicly known that that's a thing that exists.
Okay.
So I've looked at that personally. Now, when you look at the middleware layers, so you see like in that dotted box, there's some middleware that's shared by both OSs. There's some that's not. So how do I know that? How do I know that stuff exists? Well, there are books that exist, some in which I believe are written by people who work at Apple who talk about this. And furthermore, there are people who reverse engineer things, who have provided evidence that the structure that we see here is in fact the structure that is one that exists. And in fact, there has been testimony here during this trial from people who work at Apple who've spoken to the fact that these two operating systems share core components.
But they're not, okay, that's fine. Continue.
So, Professor Mickens, I think that you were explaining the shared components that appear on this demonstrative. Could you just explain the remaining layers that you hadn't addressed?
Yes. So, as we kind of just discussed, there is an OS kernel that is shared between both iOS and macOS. That's open source. Its name is Darwin. There's also a set of middleware which is shared between iOS and macOS. So, what does this shared OS functionality do? Well, it's responsible for implementing some of the lowest level management tasks on the device. But perhaps more importantly for this case, that shared OS functionality is responsible for enforcing many of the core OS-based security mechanisms. So, for example, memory protection and things like that. It's also responsible for providing the infrastructure, the plumbing that makes sandboxing possible. So that's what those shared functionality pieces do. Now, if we go one row up in the demonstrative, we see that there is middleware, OS middleware, some of which is specific to iOS and to macOS. Now, the reason why some of that differs is because, for example, an iOS has a different user interface based on a touch screen in comparison to a macOS. So you need some different OS code to deal with that kind of stuff. You also have some specific middleware on the two platforms for customizing some of those core OS level security features, and in particular to help to implement some of these different distribution channels that we see on the two platforms.
So, Professor Mickens, could you explain to the court how security gets enforced on macOS?
Yes. So if we look at this demonstrative, what am I showing here? Well, I'm showing for both iOS and macOS the shared set of functionality in the operating system that provides on-device security. That's what we're seeing at the bottom, sort of in the green. And so we've looked at a version of this slide before when I was talking about how security is enforced on iOS. And so what I want to call your attention to here is that if we look at the bottom layer in the green, we see a lot of overlap between these various ovals. We see a lot of security mechanisms, in other words, that are provided by both iOS and macOS. Why is there that overlap there? Well, I explained that on the previous slide. It's because iOS and macOS share the same kernel and a lot of their middleware. So if we look at the top in the blue, here we see those off-device security mechanisms. These are the things that are sort of involved with implementing various policies for different distribution channels. And so what we see is that on both iOS and macOS, there is support for code signing, although not all distribution channels require that on these two platforms. On both of the platforms, there is support for developer identification, although the two platforms have application channels that may implement that in different ways. And then furthermore, on both platforms, you have support for app review, although not all distribution channels on these two platforms use that. So these are the sort of common pieces of functionality.
So, Professor Mickens, does macOS do anything differently to ensure security from iOS?
It does. So if we go to the next demonstrative, what we show here are some of the features that are currently unique to macOS, although I believe that they could be implemented on iOS with minimal engineering effort because there's so much shared plumbing between the two platforms. So if we look up at the top right, we see on the macOS side, there's this notarization oval, this new notarization oval. That's basically the part of the Mac distribution model that deals with running that malware scan on the server side and then making sure that Apple can produce that signed message saying, we found no malware here. So that part's currently not implemented on iOS for off-device security, although, like I mentioned, I think that it could. Now, if we look at the...
But they'd have to create it new.
What do you mean by create it new?
Have to write code for the mobile device.
I believe that the amount of code that would have to be written is actually quite minimal. And the reason is because, and I sound like a broken record perhaps at this point, if you look at the green part in the bottom, we see a bunch of common security mechanisms. And in fact, can we go to the next demonstrative, please? So this is sort of a natural place to talk about this. So if we look at this demonstrative, what it's showing is that on the left, I believe that you could actually take these models and move them to the iOS. And so if you look at that green part at the bottom, you see that there are components that are on macOS, like Gatekeeper, like malware scanners, like the notarization, that I'm showing sort of having these arrows coming to pre-existing green parts. Those are the pieces of technical plumbing that I think would allow those features from macOS to be brought over to iOS. So I got a little bit ahead of myself, but I wanted to just have this up when we were having this conversation. Let me tell you specifically what Gatekeeper and malware scanners do. So specifically, what the malware scanners do on macOS is that they essentially look to try to see if malicious code has gotten onto the device, and if so, they try to get rid of it. So do these malware scanners currently exist on iOS? Not currently. Do I think that they could? I think the answer is yes. Because if you look at the plumbing, the infrastructure from the operating system that is needed to implement these features, it's all there. It's all those green boxes that are shared across both platforms. Now, if you look on the right in macOS, there's this thing called Gatekeeper that you may have heard about earlier. What is Gatekeeper? Gatekeeper is basically a program that runs on macOS. And at a high level, when you try to install an application, Gatekeeper looks at the signature and tries to determine which application distribution model it came from. Did it come from the macOS store, which means that it's going to be signed by Apple. Did it come from the notarization model, which means that the app will be signed by a developer known to Apple? Or did it come from that third channel? And then depending on the signature that Gatekeeper finds, it may prompt the user to say something like, oh, this app was notarized, but you haven't allowed notarized apps, or this app wasn't signed by anyone. Do you want that type of application to be installed? So Gatekeeper essentially looks at signatures and then executes the policy. So why do I show that being capable of being implemented on iOS? Because how do you check signatures? Well, you need operating system support to allow the signature in a piece of digital content to be found. And that's on iOS. That's part of that shared OS functionality that both iOS and macOS have. So this is why I think that, for example, if we wanted to take the notarization model and port it, use it on iOS, that's why I think that it's possible.
And Professor Mickens, your discussion there, you focused on notarization and Gatekeeper. Just for completeness sake, I see that malware scanners are listed here too. I take it you have the same opinion with respect to malware scanners?
Yes, that's right. And so malware scanners, you can think of those as essentially being pieces of code that examine app behavior and try to figure out if that behavior is malicious. And malware scanners can also be implemented on iOS because there is that same shared support across both OSs for doing behavioral introspection, through the sandboxing introspection layer.
Professor Mickens, if Apple were to allow users to access apps through channels outside of the App Store, how, in your opinion, would that impact users' security experience?
I don't think that it would have a meaningful difference on the security experience.
So, Professor Mickens, can you walk us through the implications of the various app distribution channels that you've discussed on both iOS and macOS today?
Yes, I can. So if we look at the next demonstrative, then what we show here is now I'm showing you all 6 application distribution channels that we've talked about today. So each row is a channel. We're looking at the channels that I've talked about for iOS and for macOS. Now, what we see is that for all of these different distribution channels, all of which are supported, I want to say, in today's world. So already these operating systems are capable of supporting multiple distribution channels. What we see is that for each one of these channels, if you look at sort of the columns off to the right, so apps reviewed by Apple, apps signed by, then we see a diversity of text in those particular columns. In some cases, apps are reviewed centrally by Apple. In some cases, they're not. In some cases, they are, but it's only a malware scan. Similarly, if we look at the app signed by column, we see diversity there as well. In some cases, apps are signed by Apple. In some cases, they're signed by enterprise developers. In some cases, by third-party developers, or not at all in some cases. So we see diversity on that side of the table. But what do we see in the on-device OS security features column? We see yeses all the way down. So what does that mean? That means that regardless of the distribution channel that is being used to get apps onto an Apple device, at least in these 6 models that we're looking at, all of the on-device OS security features, memory protection, sandboxing, so on and so forth, they're all enforced. And so the importance of this chart is several-fold. First of all, it shows that empirically, Apple devices already support multiple distribution channels. Second, it shows that in those channels, the on-device security features provided by the OS are still enforced. And what this means is that if iOS was opened up to third-party distribution channels, you could imagine adding another row to this table where maybe we have a different set of yeses or nos on those last 2 columns, but we still have a yes in the on-device OS security feature column.
Professor Mickens, are the distribution channels that appear on this chart mutually exclusive?
They are not. And this is another important thing to keep in mind. So, for example, if we look at the way that the Mac OS world currently operates today, this is not an act of imagination, You can imagine that some users might only want to download apps from the Mac store, and that's fine. That's allowable today. You could imagine also a different user who, for whatever reason, only wants to install apps that are notarized, that don't go through the central Mac store. That's also possible too. The user could maybe want to use both, so on and so forth. And so why is this so critical to this case? It's because if iOS were opened up to third-party app stores, that would not, for example, prevent users from using the regular app store. It would not in any way encroach on Apple's ability to perform reviews for apps that come through the central app store process. These things can coexist, and users can choose which channel or channels they want to use to download and install apps.
Professor Mickens, would opening up app distribution on iOS mean that Apple would have to stop performing app review on iOS?
No, and this is a really critical point to make, that if iOS were opened up to these additional channels, the App Store wouldn't have to be changed at all. Apple could still use whatever internal processes it had to scan for malware, to look for desired aesthetic qualities for apps. There's no reason that Apple couldn't keep doing that today. And we already see, as I kind of alluded to earlier, that at least on macOS, a layperson user already has access to multiple distribution channels, none of which impinge on Apple's ability to perform the review process as it sees fit.
Professor Mickens, would implementing any of these alternative distribution channels on iOS make the iPhone any less secure than the macOS, in your opinion?
I don't believe so, no.
Professor Mickens, at the beginning of your testimony, or early in your testimony today, the court asked you a question about Android. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, your testimony today has focused heavily on macOS, not Android. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And why have you focused on macOS and not Android in your discussion?
Well, because I think that if you look at macOS and iOS, these are two operating systems, although they share important pieces of functionality, but these are two operating systems which Apple itself has written, which Apple itself has advertised as being extremely secure. But when we look at this chart, this demonstrative, what we see is that macOS, which is touted by Apple in public-facing documentation as providing a very secure experience, we see that it allows a variety of distribution channels in which apps may not be fully reviewed by Apple or reviewed at all. And yet, Apple says, once again in public-facing documentation that anyone can see on their websites and in their commercials, they say that macOS is secure. And so that's why the comparison between iOS and macOS is so important, because let's even say that we think that Android somehow is radically less secure. Well, let's just look at iOS versus macOS, two products that Apple itself has made, two products that Apple itself says are secure, but two products of which support a variety of application distribution channels with some very different properties. And yet, all of those distribution channels still enforce the on-device OS security features.
Your Honor, no further questions.